Welcome back to Head to Heart Podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Markham. Today, a brand new guest is joining us. Ellie, why don't you take the time to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, anything important we should know about you, and one fun fact, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show, Jenny. So my name is Ellie. I'm a former nurse who now currently practices as a trauma practitioner and a transitions life coach, and live in Minnesota with my family. Um, Moved here when I was 5 as an immigrant from Russia. And so that was a fun cultural shift for me. But then come from a family of nurses, worked as a nurse for 9 years, and transitioned out into more trauma care just because I love taking care of the whole body, the soul, the heart, and the spirit of people. And so a lot of my work is just helping people befriend their nervous system or that connection between their heart and their mind, as well as regulate out of hard emotions or traumatic events, and then create healthy bandwidths in relationships to themselves, to God, to others. How do you learn to be present in life and actually go after the big callings and do it with joy? And how do we actually declutter from all the trauma triggers and then create space for all the good, all the fun stuff that God has for us?
Oh, sign me up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is one fun fact?
Yeah, so fun fact is when I was 24, I had plans to go to the Peace Corps and then pivoted kind of not necessarily last minute, but ended up quitting my job, selling everything, and living abroad for a year as a medical volunteer and stayed in 6 different countries within that time. And the fun part was I challenged myself to be strict vegan for that year. So it was an adventure of just going to different countries. A lot of them were underdeveloped and trying to stick to a very strict diet. Um, it was fun because you get to eat things that you like, fruits and vegetables that you don't necessarily see at home. So you get to become very curious, and I loved that. But
That is a challenge. Wow, big shift in your plans, and then also you're like, I think I'll try being vegan.
why not? Let's be extreme, right?
So, Ellie, what have you been set free from?
Yeah, I really like this question. One thing that I've been set free from was disordered eating in my life. It's funny that people will ask me that question of like, well, what created that, or what even started your disordered eating habits, or like different patterns where there was eating disorders. And for me, I realized it started with just not feeling control in my family, like feeling out of control, very inconsistent, migrating from a different country, parents working really hard. And I come from a family of 5. I'm the middle child. So it was kind of chaotic and tumultuous, just because there's constant shifts from, the time I was born in poverty, moving. My parents were trying to start back up. And so that was the one thing I had control over, was just my eating patterns. That's one thing that as a kid, I felt like I could control. And so on top of that, once I became a teenager, which is when it kind of started, I also got a lot of positive attention from it with my friends, with like boyfriends or just guys. And it kind of followed me, that pattern, whether it was like binge eating and going into sugar crashes, or doing the opposite and like being very strict, even with my, like I mentioned, the veganism, like being very, very strict and trying to control my input. Um, and at one point I just realized, like, I think this is what I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. I can't have a safe relationship with food. So when I started that year abroad, that's when a lot of that healing journey started for me. When I learned to hear God's voice for the first time. And that's when I realized I actually have a really harsh inner critic, and I'm trying to control or incorporate something into my life, but I'm trying to ultimately disconnect from my mind and connect with others. And so through that journey, that's where I started to learn to heal some of the shame or some of the broken parts of myself that felt fragmented, and felt like I couldn't invite people into my mess. Like I felt very safe with God, but I didn't quite feel safe with people. And so that was the journey of just learning to invite people in and invite community to replace that need for control. And I think the final piece was when I started working on my nervous system with a a practitioner as well, and realized, oh, this is what's actually going on in my body. And reshifting that of, this is me trying to seek comfort and to soothe, but it's actually hurting me. And what I really need is connection with people on top of connection with God. And so trying to even learn that balance of how can we learn to trust the God in others, that if God placed people on the earth as his body, how can I take some of that love and embrace it too? Because sometimes connection and relationships can be scary and not safe because that wasn't our past. And so that's something that is just a piece of the journey, but it started with disordered eating, and that's something that I've been set free from.
Wow, that's beautiful. I mean, you even mentioned it. We need people, we need the body of Christ, and we do get to choose, as we get older, we get to choose who is in our life and who isn't necessarily a huge part of our lives, but we don't get to choose our family. We always have that family, and, boundaries will look different as we grow older and are able to move or set different boundaries, but I would love to ask you, why is it that family seems to be the group of people who can affect our emotions the most out of everyone else in life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think anyone can relate to that. Like, it's family that disrupts us the most or affects us, like you said, whether it's positive or negative. And if you think about how God created family, it's supposed to be this unit of comfort and support and our means of survival. From when you're first born, you're completely dependent on your caretakers, your parents, your siblings, to give you a sense of what is safe, what is not. Are you going to get your needs, your very, very basic needs met in order to survive and grow and thrive until you're able to make those decisions on your own? And one fun fact is that our nervous system, or the connection between our mind and our body, is directly affected by the 5 people closest to you. And so, especially with that mom connection, so whether it was your mom or whoever was raising you as a primary caretaker, they are the ones that really replicate their inner world. So, how they connect to our needs and how they meet our needs, how consistent they are, has a direct correlation to how we will identify with what is safe in relationships and what is not. They teach us about what it feels like to have needs, what it feels like to take up space, what it feels like to connect with others, and whether our patterns are to blame, to run, to hide. So we really do absorb a lot of that the first 5 years, especially when our brain is developing. And then again, these people are people that we know the most. If you think about your parents, your siblings, they're people that have seen you at your best and your worst. And so it makes a lot of sense that they affect our emotions. And then another underlying thing is that they're the people who resemble the closest DNA to our own. So we share experiences that imprint in our minds and our bodies. Typically, because we're sharing that DNA, there is that mutual goal, or even those events. If you think of like traumatic events, there is such a thing as trauma bonding, and families. It is a good thing at times for families to bond and get together, because it's your place of belonging. It's your sense of home, or a place you can constantly come back to. At least that's how God intended for it to be. But because they've also seen our traumas and they have that access, they can also hurt us the most, and affect us the most, because we're just so deeply intertwined on a brain level, on a nervous system level, and just spirit to spirit, because these are people that were the foundation of what relationship looks like for us, and where we gathered some of that information and observed and absorbed it into our own psyche.
Wow. It's very true. We're intertwined whether we try to be or not. And then as time goes on, we're able to learn how to regulate ourselves more and decide how much do we want to be intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about it, God really made us with connection in mind, whether it's connection to himself, connection to others, connection to ourselves.
Not everything is going to apply, but quite a few things we're going to talk about in this episode can definitely apply to your blood family and then also your in-law family if you're married. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm very excited to hear your answer to this question. I just keep pondering it over and over. But what does this verse in Exodus 20, verse 12, honor your father and mother, what does that really look like? And it seems to hold a lot of extra weight because of this promise that's attached to it. So I'll read it. It says, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So what does that look like, to honor your parents, regardless of how close you are with them?
I really appreciate that you brought this one up because this one is a challenge for a lot of people. And I remember walking through that process too of God, how do I honor my parents when I'm going back, my mind is going back through some of those triggers or traumatic events, and I want to blame and be angry and I want to disconnect so that I can heal. Like it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't feel safe for me to be in my family right now. Or when I am, all I can think about is where I've been wronged. And so when you think about what the world says that respect is earned.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when we look at the Bible, first of all, we honor God because of who he is. And we're called to honor and walk in honor towards others. And I remember walking through that process as well, and just God really meeting me and going through a season of him sharing that we honor because it's a way that we do not lose sight of God's fingerprints in others. If we're all made in the image of God, how can I still honor the fact that this person, even if they're maybe not acting it out or living it out, this person or our family, our mom and dad, if they're people who were in a season of healing from some of those attachments and connections, or where it was painful for us, how can I still see God in them, and what he's made them to be, or the things that he's placed in their lives, and kind of focus on that instead of, sometimes we'll find an excuse to blame our parents, or pull people on our side, or gossip, or make them, elevate ourselves while bringing them down. And honor is just to really elevate someone. It's a conscious choice. And so I think there's definitely room for, especially in the healing season, to create some distance or process that. But when it comes to honor, you also think about honoring your lineage. I wholeheartedly believe that there's always some kind of good. Even when we were talking about DNA that we share, there's always some kind of replica of you in your family line. And there's always some form of good that we get to carry on like a thread into the next generation. And so by honoring our parents, honoring what they did do right, or maybe what they did pull through from the other generation, whether it's maybe a good work ethic, or the way they kept your, safe home safe. Maybe it was too safe because it was like overprotective. But just honoring the things that you can, acknowledging the good, is a way to honor and elevate in those seasons versus bringing people down. And it also means things like saying what you mean and meaning what you say, or creating agreements where you can hold honor in your heart, but then also hold some of that tension.
I love that. To honor is to elevate someone. You know, so many different people are listening to this episode, so many different types of families are represented, that it really is the most safe for them to not be living near their blood family, or they need to work out different boundaries because the boundaries that are set are not working currently. So it's so good to hear that, like, no matter how your family has been, there is some possible way for you to honor them, even if they don't necessarily deserve or have earned your respect. And I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's tough work too. And it doesn't mean we discredit our experience, but it's just being mindful of where are we actually putting someone down in order to elevate ourselves, and being really mindful of that.
Hmm.
And it's a journey of inviting God into that.
Yeah, and to put someone down and to gossip about someone, there's a reason why we do it. It's because it feels really good. It feels good to say, this was my experience with this person, and they did this awful thing, because if we say that experience, we can't necessarily be proven wrong. We just feel so right in the moment of like, this was wrong and it was an injustice against me.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a reason why we die to our flesh as well as we follow Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's definitely a practice.
One that we can get better at every day. Thank God.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone is trying to walk through forgiveness and work through triggers where there have been repeated offenses or a family member has never apologized, how could they start to do that even when it feels really difficult?
So when it comes to walking through forgiveness, that's really, really tough to do. And I want to first acknowledge that because it has a lot of emotions that comes up with it. And I think part of walking through forgiveness is recognizing what it is, which is it's an opportunity for you to release a person from having access to your story and your emotional world. And part of that is recognizing that a lot of our family patterns are deeply ingrained in us. And so we're choosing a different way by choosing forgiveness. And it can feel so out of control because we're trying to do the self work and create healthy family patterns and trying not to incorporate or redo some of the stuff the injustices that have happened. And that's where we get to learn where we maybe overinvested ourselves. And so a big part of that is actually just realizing with forgiveness, there's often a lot of anger that comes up, there's some blame, and there's a lot of pain and hurt. And sometimes it's easier, especially in the Christian world, to say just forgive them and that'll help you move on. But I remember sitting with a therapist when I was walking through my own healing journey with my parents and walking through my father wound and then my mother wound and just trying to heal some of those generational pain points that happened in my own life. And my therapist talked to me about how what you resist persists. And so if you're resisting to feel something, even though you're saying, I forgive them, your body is actually not forgiving them. You may have in your head, but that's why you get triggered every time it comes up. And I remember her walking through me through an exercise and asking me, do you want to forgive your mom right now in this moment? And I remember my body just had this visceral reaction of no, I don't. I don't want to forgive her right now because I'm so angry. And I loved that my therapist, she was a Christian therapist and had no judgment and said, okay, well, when it's time, you can raise that question again. And it actually opened this beautiful opportunity for me to feel what I needed to feel, to ride that wave, to actually acknowledge, hey, there was an injustice that happened, even if I am blowing it out of proportion, which I don't believe we are. Our body will signal to us with anger when our boundaries are crossed or when injustices happen or when something is violated within our own values. And actually giving myself to space that and feel that was so healing. And I got to a place where I could forgive easily after just because I didn't suppress. And so even though forgiveness is a choice and not a feeling, I do believe that there's a big process that we sometimes forget to acknowledge of we need to invite those emotions in because it's often someone in our past who told us that we couldn't feel that or brought shame in, and it makes it so much harder for us to forgive because now we have to deal with the pain that comes with it. But there is outlets and there are access points for us to go through those emotions and let our body actually ride that wave out so that we can not just say it in our minds and then get triggered every time we see the person, but actually walk through forgiveness. And it involves inviting your body and being present with yourself in the parts where other people have not been.
Wow, I love that. And I love the phrase, what you resist persists. That's so good to keep in mind. So, if some listeners are trying to take some practical action and they do start to feel triggered or, anxious, angry, whatever, how can they regulate themselves when they're around those family members?
So triggers are something that I love talking about because triggers are such a gift if you allow them to really highlight what's going on for you. Because triggers are essentially younger parts of us waiting to be seen and heard. And triggers also carry at the root of them some of our unmet needs. And the root of every trigger is one of two things: it's either rooted in abandonment or rejection towards our emotional needs. So, when we were very little, especially before age 5, our brain is not developed to, again, regulate or ask for what we need in a safe way, as well as our brain is just absorbing things. Our nervous system is absorbing what's right, what's wrong, how we should be treated, whether it's safe to ask for what we need. Are we actually going to get what we want out of others? Will people stay in connection to us if we are needy, or if we're hurting, or if we have big reactions? And that really sets the foundation in our lives of how we're going to connect in relationship to others and to ourselves. And so triggers are often those parts of us where we did ask for something, or we needed emotional support, or for someone to connect with us in a moment, but instead we were met with abandonment or rejection. And as we grew up and our brains started to interpret this and find reasoning, it's those parts that are still lacking connection and still have unmet needs. And they will continue to have outbursts, and essentially it's a cry for help of, hey, I still have this need to feel seen or heard or wanted. And so it's a beautiful invitation if we allow it to be. And triggers feel so automatic to us because we go into survival mode with fight, flight, freeze. And it's so quick in our brain because our brain has chosen a pathway that's fastest. When we don't get connection, it's so painful to us as beings that we will trigger, and we will have some kind of way to protect our hearts. But again, our hearts were created for connection, and when we can't connect, we will default to protection. And so how we break that cycle is starting to recognize the story that we're telling ourselves. And it's so hard to do because our brain, essentially our reasoning brain, goes offline during a trigger, and it's just our emotional brain that's hijacking the entire situation. And so one simple way that you can learn to regulate, and it takes a process, this is a lot of what I do with my clients and in my work, but it's creating a pause. Because where there's abandonment or rejection or unmet needs, if you think of the last time you had a trigger, what you were missing was curiosity and compassion. There was a lot of shame, there was a lot of judgment, even if it was coming from yourself, towards that younger part for even having needs. And so a way for us to create that curiosity and compassion is just to reorient to the body. Often I'll invite my clients to take a deep breath, or put their hand on their heart and just feel their heartbeat, and create a little bit of a pause where it feels so automatic in our brain and in our body to trigger, but we create that pause and gently invite a little bit of compassion back in, whether it's from yourself, whether it's even just acknowledging, hey, right now, this really hurts. Ouch. Or this is so uncomfortable for me. And rewriting that a little bit, as opposed to having that harsh inner critic or the voices from the past hijacking our story and our conversation and making us loop even more deeper into our trigger. And so there's a series of steps that we can take as we build that capacity to represent ourselves or show up again with compassion in a trigger and get that need met. But that's usually the first step, is just creating a little bit of a pause, anchoring back to your sensations, and finding one little step towards connection or connection to compassion, whether it's from yourself or from others.
I'm so glad you mentioned that you help people put their hand over their heart or remain present, because I've been feeling so challenged recently to be curious and then also be present, because I feel like the Lord pointed out to me that the only place I can experience his presence is in the present.
That's good.
Because he's outside of time, he is in the past, present, and future, but I myself am only here in the present. So even if I feel like, okay, the Lord's taking me back to my inner child and back to a memory I have and healing that, even that healing work can only happen here and now if I choose to.
Mm.
So that's really awesome.
Yeah, it makes me think of the word compassion means with passion. If you break it down, it's with passion or with presence to actually
Mm,
stay present with someone. And even in triggers, sometimes our lens of God can be so warped because we start to hear the voices of our parents or those who hurt us in our, from our past. And that's all we see is judgment or shame. But when we again create that pause, we can actually start to question and get curious, is that the voice of a loving father as I'm triggering and self-shaming? Is that really his voice or is that my voice? And how can I invite some kindness? Because ultimately God created us with needs so that he could fill them. There's no shame in having needs. That's part of being human. That's part of why we need connection. And so it's just rewiring some of that and rewriting some of that story with those two key components.
wow. There's a verse in First Peter, I believe, and if it's not in First Peter, I will actually link the verse and the reference in the show notes, but there's a verse, it's either second or First Peter, that it says God has given us everything we need to live a life of godliness. And I think that's so important to realize because everything you're saying about working through these things, it's about learning how to do that work. And it's not something that we need to pull an outside resource, and it's not something that we don't have the capability of doing with God and with other people in our own bodies. So I think that's so amazing how God has given us everything we need to heal and to rewire our brains and to work through triggers. And we may not even notice it. We just have to learn how.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a beautiful journey when you think of it that way of like it's a grand invitation to wholeness
Mhm.
if you allow it to be.
Wow. I'm in awe. I am in awe of God. And then if there's a listener who is like, okay, I have tried to set a boundary, I've said it directly and have said what I mean what I say, maybe multiple times, but that boundary is still being repeatedly crossed by someone else, what should they do in that situation?
Yeah, something that I often ask people in this situation is what is the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum? Often an ultimatum is, and this is how a lot of like even on social media I'll see people say this is a boundary. An ultimatum is, hey, if you do this then I will do this, if you do this I will break connection with you, is ultimately what an ultimatum is. That's what you're saying. A boundary is actually quite different. Boundaries are what helps us keep our love in. There's a book that I love by Danny Silf called Keep Your Love On, and he really deconstructs boundaries. And he has this graph in there where you think about the center of who you are and your boundaries, your personal boundaries of how much is too much space with someone. Like when someone is even just standing too close to you, what's comfortable and what's not. Something as simple as that. We all have our innate boundaries of what we feel as comfortable, safe, connecting, and what doesn't. And so it's our capacity to love and just operate out of love. And then he has rings that go out of it. So the center is our connection with God. And then the second ring is you and either your spouse or your parent or one really close person. And it usually only has space for one person. And that's the person that has more access to you. The other ring is your family, especially immediate family or people who you choose to call family that are doing life with you. And then the ring after that is friends, acquaintances, coworkers, peers, and then just strangers. And so it actually puts boundaries on different levels of we can't give all of ourselves 100% of the time. We see this Jesus does this too. He has his the multitudes that he speaks to, but he would often go away and take time with just the 12 disciples, sometimes just the 3. And often he needed space with just him and his heavenly Father just to keep that love in, to fuel it. And so a boundary is essentially saying, "Hey, I want to love you and I want to have connection with you, In order to do that, this is the boundary. And if I cross that, that's when I start to feel triggered and violated, and it feels like an injustice in my own system. And it's actually really good to communicate that. And it takes some practice because a lot of us weren't taught to communicate that. A lot of families are enmeshed or have those patterns where one person's emotional world is ruling the entire family, or it's so chaotic. And so those conversations never happened. But if we're trying to set a boundary and say, hey, this is in order for me to stay in connection with you and love you, this is what I need. And if that's not being met, I often start talking to people about the fact that your need for connection doesn't go away just because someone didn't meet it. And so we can use that as information to stop looking for connection in that place and seek it somewhere else. And that can be so painful because we wanted connection. Let's say it's a family member and you want connection with them. You want to stay, you want to have them in your life in a bigger capacity. You want them to be in that smaller, closer ring, but they're choosing not to. And they're saying, I can't meet that. Um, or if they do, it costs you living out of love. And so that's where we get to choose, okay, if this person can't meet that need, how can I rely on others in that place? Because that's where often boundaries get dropped of, okay, I set a boundary, it wasn't met, and now I'm just going to get triggered and angered at this person every time. But if we really focus on what is the need here, I needed this person to connect with me, and this is how what I needed to get loved, we can still meet that from other sources, and we can still practice advocating for ourselves or saying no and breaking some of those guilt cycles that happen of, well, again, I was not enough. And again, rooted in abandonment or rejection, and kind of cutting that off and saying, okay, well, if this person is not willing to, if they're unable to ask what I'm saying in order to stay in connection with them, or to stay, have my love on, how can I get this need met somewhere else? And so we just start looking for other alternatives. And there's no issue in even voicing that with other people. I think it's hard because that's where a lot of blame can come in or hurt. And when we're hurt, it's really hard to communicate. But if you bring it back onto yourself and what you need and what it would require for you to keep your love on, then you stay in like your own authority and in your own power of how you want to respond in life. And that does take some time. So I do have a lot of compassion for that. But it's just coming back to how can you keep love in for yourself? And what are some of those boundaries?
I have never heard the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum before. That is so interesting. And it's really empowering to hear, okay, if someone doesn't meet this need I have, you know, the hurt I feel from that doesn't have to completely dictate our relationship from here on out. And I can't ever really trust this person ever again. But I can trust them maybe in a different capacity, or I'm not going to expect this from them anymore. I'm going to go get this need met from the Lord, from this different person, from this safe place. And I think that's so empowering to hear, when someone fails you, you don't need to cut them out of your life completely. There's other things you can do first and then walk forward in healthy boundaries. Because the world would say, I mean, cancel culture is huge. It would say, this person hasn't earned my respect, and therefore they're out of my life. Don't ever talk to me again?
Yeah, definitely. And kind of what I was saying earlier, sometimes when we grew up with, which I think a lot of us, most of us have, in some kind of dysfunction in your family, you are focusing on others to tell you how you're doing. And so that boundary can get very permeable because we're relying on them to tell us our identity or whether we're worth connecting to. And so actually putting a boundary and looking at through the lens of how can I keep love in without creating disconnection really brings that power back to yourself so that you're learning to walk intuitively with yourself and know when you have a need or when you need connection, and then actually have access points, like you said, towards God, towards others. Because if they don't have the capacity, whoever you wanted to put that boundary with, then you get to release them from that and say, okay, well, the need didn't go away, So I'm just going to look somewhere else. Thank you for letting me know that you're not a person who has capacity for that.
Wow. I love that. That takes a lot of pressure off of a lot of friendships, a lot of family relationships, so that people can just be honest about where they're at.
Hmm. Yeah, honesty's hard.
It is really hard, but it's worth it. So worth it.
Hmm.
So, if people want to find you, what you do, any resources you have, where would they be able to do that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on social media. So through Instagram, my handle is Ellie Monj, so Ellie, and part of my last name, Monj. And also on Facebook, you can search for my full name. Otherwise, they can go on my website, freetolivewellness.com, where I share a little bit more about my work, my services, and just a little bit more of my story too.
Ellie, you were a dream guest. You're so knowledgeable and you are so compassionate and passionate about helping people work through these things. So, thank you for being the guest today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure just sharing a little bit of this is very much my story too. Like I try to practice what I preach. So much compassion for that because so many of us are going through this and what a joy that we get to do it together.
Mhm.